Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our, second session of the day, but first workshop session of the day. We're thrilled to have you here. My name is Cindy Borden with NCHV, and I'll be sort of the facilitator for today's session. So we're thrilled that you're here. Today's session is following up from the keynote that you guys all heard just not so long ago, is around racial equity in programs and system outcomes. So we're really talking about racial equity from the standpoint of client veteran outcomes, but we'll be sort of touching a little bit on some of the other things towards the end of the session as well. Everyone should know by now the logistics of GoToWebinar and how it works. But you've all entered muted, and you'll stay muted for the whole session. But we do want to hear from you. We do want you to ask questions. So please use that question box for GoToWebinar. Submit your questions as they come. We'll get to as many of them as we can. And we promise if there's ones we don't get to, we'll forward them on to the speakers and get answers for you as well, because we think that's really, really important. So with that said, I am going to introduce all three of our speakers. I am going to do very basic introductions. You can read their full bios in the guidebook app if you're interested in learning more about them. They all have fantastic experience, and so I encourage you to do that. But we have our first speaker today is going to be Sean Liu. And Sean is the Community Engagement Coordinator for the VHA Homeless Programs Office. After Sean, we'll have Jeffrey Rollins. And he's the SSO Coordinated Entry Director for the Johnson Lee Harnett Community Action in North Carolina. And then last but certainly not least, we have Darryl Vincent. Darryl's the COO for US Vets. And Darryl is joining us from Hawaii, so it is very early for him. So aloha to Darryl, and thanks for getting up early with us. And with that, I am going to pass things over to Sean.
Great, thanks, Cindy. Hey, everybody. I know we have a packed agenda today, and we got a lot of stuff we want to cover, so I'm going to go ahead and dive on in. Next slide, please. Want to start off talking about how we're thinking about implementing racial equity in VHA homeless programs across the country. We're going to provide a little bit of insight into what we're planning, a framework to think about when implementing race equity, and just kind of a teaser on some of the things that are going to be lying ahead. But before we do, I want to kind of lay some groundwork, if that's okay. Next slide, please. First and foremost, we want to recognize that this type of conversation can be fraught, it can be uncomfortable at times, and many of us often fear saying the wrong things or unintentionally offending. So rather than the cancel culture that seems to be in the zeitgeist, I'd like to start us off employing that we deploy a liberated space. What is a liberated space? Well, it's this general idea that we're creating a space recognizing that we're all people, we're all human, and oftentimes we make mistakes, intentional or not, but we're going to work together as a community, born out of love and shared interests to heal what was broken and to really, really forge a new path ahead. Next slide, please. So with that sentiment, as you have questions in the chat or as you go through this work going forward, I really encourage you to think about the way in which we all represent a shared community, that we work with each other with that spirit of love, and that we work together to heal the brokenness that was in our country and then move forward in kind of a new vision that lies ahead. Next slide, please. So with that type of groundwork in place, you should know that historically, unsurprisingly, Black veterans and American Indian, Native American veterans show up and experience homelessness in rates that are disproportionate to how they represent in the main veteran population. And it's within this context that last year, the Homeless Programs Office at the Department of Veterans Affairs started our racial equity and racial justice work groups, specifically to make sure that as we move forward, that our services are equitable and that we're making sure that we can provide really, really effective services to all veterans based off of all of their diverse needs. We're largely focusing these efforts in three main areas: policy and program improvements, direct patient care improvements, and staff support. So next slide, please. Some of our core values are thus: we believe that if we are going to really make good on this once-in-a-generation opportunity to end veteran homelessness and recommit to our efforts, we need to make sure that our systems are equitable along the way. And for us at the Homeless Programs Office, this means embedding the concepts of racial equity into all of our core values and then working across all of our programs in a collaborative way to make sure that all of our services are really effective. Some of the things that we're looking at doing this particular fiscal year, and I'm going to touch on a little bit more about an improvement initiative in the next coming slides, but you should know that we're looking at doing a large-scale organizational assessment to see what are the opportunities in which we can bake equity in our policies and in the ways that we do business, providing more educational opportunities to staff, not only with VA, but also to the public as you navigate issues of race equity, and developing a mentorship program to help support staff in their own journeys. Next slide, please. You should know that this work that we're doing has a bit of synergy. First and foremost, it synergizes with this executive order that the president signed, his first executive order that he signed in his administration, advancing racial equity. Next slide, please. It's also consistent with our homeless program's new strategic plan that we recently released, setting out 6 key objectives for our vision for the future in this renewed work to end veteran homelessness. Objective 6 actually focuses on developing equitable systems. So we are not doing this in a vacuum. We're doing this in concert with a lot of really, really important objectives and people setting really, really important visions. Next slide, please. All right. Continuing on with the level setting, I want to introduce some key terms to make sure that we're on the same page. First off, we want to kind of define what we mean when we say equity, because I'm going to use that word quite a bit over the course of the remaining bit of this presentation. So when we think about equity, this is actually from the executive order. We're talking about the consistent and systematic, fair, just, and impartial treatment of all individuals, including those belonging to underserved communities. One additional term that I want to introduce is the concept of health equity, so the little adjective that we'll add on to it. VHA, the Veterans Health Administration, is a healthcare organization, so health equity is important. And borrowing this from HHS, we think of health equity as the attainment of the highest level of health for all people. Now, this is the National Coalition for Homeless Veterans, so you don't need me to tell you that housing is a critical part to healthcare, and that social determinants of health is something that we all need to be mindful of. But one of the things that in a previous conversation I had with VA's Office of Health Equity, they opened my eyes to is not just social determinants of health, but structural determinants of health, the way in which our systems are structured that may influence how different veterans achieve health outcomes. Next slide, please. So in contrast to health equity, we have health disparity. Now, health disparities are a particular type of health difference that are closely linked with social, economic, and environmental disadvantages. And unsurprisingly, these adversely affect people who have systematically experienced greater obstacles in health outcomes. To put simply, when you think of something like a flu shot or a COVID vaccine, you don't want your race, your neighborhood, what economic status that you exist in. You don't want those factors influencing whether or not a vaccine works, or whether or not a knee replacement works, or whether or not a housing intervention works, right? And so in order to address health disparities, we think of an additional concept called targeted universalism. This last concept that I want to introduce to you is this idea that we, at the end of the day, want the highest level of health, the best housing outcomes for literally every veteran. We want universalist outcomes across the board. But we recognize that in doing so, in order to accomplish that, we may need to target our interventions to folks based off of a variety of circumstances. Now, although we're going to be focusing the rest of this conversation on race disparities and other health disparities for that way, I want to acknowledge that many of you have already been doing targeted universalism. If you've ever implemented housing first, recognizing that some people experiencing homelessness have greater disadvantages and thus require more interventions or different interventions, you have done targeted universalism. If you've ever prioritized in your coordinated entry system, you have also done targeted universalism. So we're actually halfway there when it comes to building skills. We just need to figure out some new solutions that will take care of disparities based off of race and ethnicity. Next slide, please. Okay, so one of the things that I'm excited to let you know is that towards the end of this fiscal year, the Homeless Program Office will be launching an internal racial equity improvement initiative, specifically to provide a framework for our local VA medical centers across the country to detect, understand, and reduce or eliminate racial disparities in access and outcomes for veterans served. Now that was a lot, so what do we mean by that? Next slide, please. Our Office of Health Equity uses this particular framework for identifying and addressing disparities, all health disparities, and this is a framework that I invite all of us to consider when addressing racial disparities in access and outcomes. It's essentially three main steps: detecting any disparities that may exist through the use of data, understanding what's causing the differences, what are the different factors at play, and reducing or eliminating those disparities through targeted interventions and improvement strategies. Next slide, please. First off, we're going to start talking about the detecting bit. Next slide, please. You should know that in concert with the launching of our Racial Equity Improvement Initiative, we are going to empower our medical centers with a racial equity dashboard that will assist specifically with the detection of disparities by providing disaggregated race and ethnicity information on total populations, access to services, exit outcomes, and length of time in programs or in housing programs. We plan to display this information at the national, VISN, which are regional, and local levels. And we hope that future iterations will also be able to provide filters by gender and age, recognizing the way intersectionality plays in health disparities. Next slide, please. So I'm excited to show you a little bit of a snippet of what this dashboard is going to look like. This first iteration, again, is largely going to be internal for our VA staff. We hope over time to really broaden our reach and our influence so that we can really share this information also with our SSVF grantees, our GPD providers, and all of our other community partners so that you can see how this information impacts all veterans in your community. But right now, one last little bit of disclaimer, this is largely here to demonstrate capacity, so please don't infer kind of anything too much into it yet. Just want to show you what we have capable of based off of the information at our disposal. This first thing that I'm showing you is actual real information though. This is population comparisons over the last year, 2020. Let me kind of orient you to what's going on here. Each group of columns represents a different race category. We have a second view that I don't have in the slide presentation today for ethnicity. The gray bar is the percentage of veterans based off of the US Census. The red bar is the percentage of veterans based off of HUD's annual homeless assessment report. And the blue bar represents veterans served by VHA homeless programs. And when you think about what we all know is that Black veterans in particular are disproportionately impacted by homelessness. That's that difference between the gray bar and the red bar. We would be worried if for Black veterans, if the blue bar was lower than the red bar, because what that would imply, if it was true, was that we would be having essentially unequal access for Black veterans. So one of the things we're heartened by is that our blue bar is higher than the red bar. And what that means is that those Black veterans have pretty good access to our services. But we should not be satisfied with that. We still have, as you can see from this chart, multiple opportunities for improvement. And we want to both be kind of humble in our approach, not be shameful in what the data shows, but follow the data where it leads so that all of our veterans can achieve the great housing outcomes that we hope. Next slide, please. Another thing that this dashboard will offer our medical centers is looking at entries, lengths of stay, and housing processing times. And these will be compared by different races. What we're going to encourage our facilities to do is take a look at their information, identify where differences exist, because they may be disparities, and then start developing plans to address. One of the things that we all kind of can agree upon, right, is that your race should not influence, for example, the amount of time it takes for you to get housed in HUD-VASH. But there may be many facilities where this is the case. And what we anticipate is, though our national level information is pretty good, there might be some variation by community. So we're really excited for this particular dashboard to show information at the medical center level and be able to filter by different programs. We also hope in future iterations to add even more granularity. So for our GPD providers out there, we'd be able to filter by your GPD project codes. Or for our HUD-VASH staff and housing authority partners, we'd be able to filter by public housing authority, giving you even more granularity to better understand what's going on. Next slide, please. Last bit in terms of capacity is also showing outcomes, which is really, really what we care about. Not just access, but making sure that when veterans work through our programs and complete their program participation, that they're exiting in positive ways. This particular view is showing us housing outcomes upon exit, permanent, transitional, temporary, etc. We also, in this current iteration, have the ability to look at essentially the character of exit, whether they exited for positive, negative, or neutral reasons. as well as employment outcomes as well, recognizing the importance that employment plays in housing stability. Again, we're going to be encouraging our medical centers to take a look at their data, see where there are differences that may lie, and work on plans to address. One of the things that I want to acknowledge, and maybe kind of gives ourselves permission to recognize, is that what we've learned from VA's Office of Health Equity is that figuring out and interpreting information like this and identifying and detecting disparities is a bit more like an art than a science. To what degree is 2 percentage points off of your total a meaningful difference? Is 5 percentage points off? 10? Hard to say, and especially hard to say when you've given the number of veterans we might be looking at the sample, which is all to say that there is a lot of opportunity here to get more comfortable and familiar with our information and better refine how we interpret this information going forward. Next slide, please. Okay, so we talked about detecting, right? But that's only part of the way. That's literally the only first step, right? The next thing we have to do is understand what is going on. And this is harder than it seems. Next slide, please. Part of the reason is just because you see information on a table and a difference exists, that information doesn't tell you what is going on to contribute to those differences. So an additional part of this particular disparities addressing framework is recognizing the myriad different factors that could go into the differences you may see in your information. When we think about the big picture, we're thinking about health systems factors, recognizing that for homeless services, the word system may also not just be VA healthcare, but also your COC, your other providers as well, the whole community, right? The different ways that our community culture, our community quality improvement efforts, the finances that our community has to address veteran homelessness. We also recognize some patient factors, and we're talking about one in particular today, race and ethnicity, but we want to acknowledge there are a lot of other patient factors that can go into the differences that we may see. There may be provider factors, individual providers' knowledge, attitudes, competing demands. You don't need me to tell you that we all feel very, very overworked these days in 2021, potential provider bias. And of course, the intersection where the patients and providers meet into individual patient encounters may also factor in, right? So all of these things we want to think of in addition to other things in our community, like rental, the amount of rent in your community, the ability for housing vouchers to be used, whether or not you have an eviction moratorium in place. A lot of things that when you're looking at your information, you need to think about, reflect upon, and consider before you could even begin to start developing an improvement project. Next slide, please. Okay. A lot of heavy lifting there going on the understand, but let's go ahead and talk a little bit now that if you think you have a pretty good hypothesis of what is going on and you're ready to make a plan for it, let's talk about reducing and eliminating those disparities. Next slide, please. From a big picture standpoint, I imagine there's a mix of kind of frontline providers, but also COC leads, system leads as well. For those system leads right now, I want to share with you 4 key components for reducing and eliminating disparities. First things first, unsurprisingly, we want to actually pilot out specific interventions and strategies, specifically focused on community-based settings that serve our vulnerable populations. As you're doing those interventions, you want to make sure that you're baking in some kind of evaluation strategy, because especially most relevant for folks like me at the national level, as these different pilots and strategies and innovations emerge, we unsurprisingly want to be able to sustain them and spread them throughout the country, right? So we'll need to determine whether or not an individual strategy or pilot for reducing disparities is ready for implementation and translating in routine settings across the country. And then finally, again, for people like me, but also for maybe for the advocates out there, is looking at how those strategies point to new policy changes that may be needed to further improve the effectiveness of these different interventions. Next slide, please. Okay, a couple other slides just to talk about how we're going to be supporting our medical centers. We are working to develop essentially a resource clearinghouse for our medical centers, not only providing links to the particular dashboard, but the ever-growing body of knowledge of addressing disparities, write-ups of specific interventions that emerge over time. Some of our future goals are to be able to also share these publicly so that you, as members of our community, can also benefit from and use these innovations that emerge from us in your own work. Next slide, please. The last little bit that I think is really going to be interesting in regards to this this improvement strategy is we're also building out a planning tool that will not only allow our medical centers across the country to actually structurally develop their improvement plans, but also give us at the national level visibility into what are some of the common themes of interventions or strategies that are emerging, what are some of the barriers for implementation, and ultimately some of the different ways we at the National Homeless Programs Office can either reduce those barriers or amplify really, really effective interventions and make sure that they spread and stick. Next slide, please. All right, so a little hope teaser for something to come. We hope that as we launch and that as our early adopters really kind of take the ball and run with this, that in future conferences, we'll be able to share some strong and innovative practices about what your communities did to reduce health disparities, racial disparities, and really improve the equity for all of our veterans. Next slide, please. Before I turn it over, I also want to give you a little bit of sneak peek of what we're thinking about as our Racial Equity Work Group and the Homeless Programs Office. Always looking for opportunities to improve policy. So if you have ideas, let us know. Offering you training opportunities that we hope to make available to the public so that as we're learning new things, you can learn along with us. Incorporating veterans with lived expertise, making sure that their voice is heard in all of this new improvement process. And of course, as I mentioned, identifying and disseminating strong and innovative practices in addressing disparities. Next slide, please. All right, I think this is my second to last slide. I do believe that you're going to be able to get a copy of this in your app. Here are some of the publicly available webinars that we've already put out that you can review to support your work. We hope to put out more content in the coming months as well, so keep an eye out for that. Next slide, please. And that is all for me. If you want to ask me some questions after, you want to know more about how you can help, if you have suggestions about how we should be proceeding, send me an email, sean.liu@va.gov. Really appreciate everybody's time. And I will turn it over, I believe, to Mr. Rawlings.
Thank you, Sean. Next slide. Okay, our topic today, of course, is going to be incorporating racial equity into local systems. This is myself, of course. I want to first give a disclaimer on this picture. This was prior to me growing hair, obviously. But I will try my level best to still remain the same person. Next slide, please. Our topic today, of course, is going to be racism and homelessness in the North Carolina balance of state, which is the area where I work. You see my name listed here, but you also see the name listed for Kevin McNamee. Kevin McNamee is from the North Carolina Coalition in Homelessness, and he has been very instrumental in putting this together. He's not a person of color, and so he often says, I feel very uncomfortable being in this setting and doing these things. I feel like I should maybe take the back seat. But Kevin has been an integral partner. He is really invested in what we're doing. He's fully vested, and it's going to take all of us in order to do this work. That being all races. So I want to make sure that I put his name and I kept him here as he worked with me to put this all together. It's going to take us all. Next slide. I want to give you a little information about my state, North Carolina. North Carolina is the 10th largest state in the country. 100 counties, ranging, of course, from the mountains to the Outer Banks, which is the coast. We have quite a few large cities: Charlotte, Raleigh. Of course, we have athletic teams here as well. So it's a very diverse state. It's a very urban state with, again, with large cities, but it's also a very rural state. And I want to stress the rural part because we have the Appalachian Mountains. So we are mountain rural in some areas of our state. Next slide, please. Okay, now our state is broken up into different continuums of care. And of course, ours that I represent is the balance of state. Balance of state is 79 of the 100 counties of North Carolina, ranging, as you can see, from the coast also up to the mountains, just as the state does. The region that I work in specifically is Region 7, as you can see in the middle of the screen. And it's the green area there. The white county right above it is Raleigh, Wake County. So we stretch from the capital all the way down to the South Carolina border. Next slide, please. Because of the fact that we are a large geographical area, it makes it very difficult for us to coordinate resources. It's very, very difficult for us to have any partners that are going to cover as much area as we actually cover ourselves. And we have very, very, very political landscape here. North Carolina is a purple state. As we saw, our state went with Obama in one election, went with Trump in another election, and during this entire time, we've had a Democratic governor the entire time, but we have a Republican legislature, both houses. So our state, we have a very, very huge diverse mix here. We see this kind of reflected in our balance of state as well. In our particular communities in the balance of state, I'm going to zero in on Region 7 where I am. We have some very progressive areas in the suburban areas, and we also have some very rural areas as we get closer to the South Carolina border. I want to kind of make this thing live a little bit with our resources and our needs that are being varied by the fact that whenever we encounter someone in our more rural areas, we often come across officials who we work with who will try to explain it away in their neighborhoods, saying that there is no homeless problem in their neighborhood. We have no homelessness here. They're able to explain it away in a small town by saying, that's John and Emily's son. He ain't never been no good. He has always been on the streets and it's because he chose to. He's not really homeless because his mom and dad are here. So there's an actual perception that if you have other options in the eyes of some of the partners, that homelessness does not exist, because they're able to explain it away. Because of this type of landscape that we have, it is very difficult for us to put together resources for our population. Next slide, please. Okay. So again, our balance of state racial equity subcommittee. We want to zero in now on what we are doing with racial equity. Next slide as well. Okay, in January of 2020, the North Carolina Coalition for Homelessness called together, and we had an open meeting where we called for people to join our racial equity subcommittee. The committee was charged with first assessing the problem, actually proving the problem itself existed, and measuring the impact of it with real data. It was imperative that the subcommittee be driven by our subcommittee members and not by the staff. Although the staff did bring the committee together, it was very important that we make sure that it was driven by the members that were on the committee. The subcommittee wasted no time getting started, and quickly after forming, we began to work on introducing racial equity questions into our scorecard, which was used to facilitate the annual COC funding competition. And work with this COC scorecard subcommittee, we were able to draft and approve questions into the COC's project application, specifically targeting providers' policies and practices towards racial equity. There was no COC competition last year due to the pandemic, but we are excited that this year, every agency that applied for COC funding will have to report on their internal racial equity efforts, and they'll be scored accordingly. This year, the scoring is bonus points for this year, but to reward agencies that are proactively adopting equitable policies, while also signaling that the expectation of the COC is that all agencies moving forward will implement those policies and that they will be weighted in future competitions. Next slide, please. In the midst of our work, this occurred, the murder of George Floyd. We started in January. We went into the pandemic in March, and then the George Floyd murder occurred. And the nation, if you see the title, the nation awoke. This has been going on for a very, very, very long time, but we've never had the attention or the nation to pause and actually assess what's going on. Next slide, please. The nation watched for 9 minutes as we watched the life being pressed out of George Floyd, and our response, as you see on the screen, is basic science, stimulus and response. You expect that if there's a stimuli that you'll have an equal response to reflect that stimuli. With George Floyd's murder, protests broke out across the entire country, and we saw something that were, at least in my lifetime, unprecedented since the civil rights movement. We watched as people began to protest, then the riot, and then looting occurred. It's easy to focus on the looters and ignore the protest. I Can't Breathe became a rallying cry and protest engulfed the entire nation. Next slide, please. We saw the stimuli, and then we saw the response. Police in riot gear, and a nation divided, with people on one side thinking that something was being taken from them, or an attempt was something for being taken from them, and then people protesting because they felt they were not being heard. On both sides, we had Americans. Next slide, please. I'll be honest, this next slide is just for my own sanity. Next slide. When I was asked to speak on something that I spoke at the North Carolina Coalition and Homelessness at their conference this year. And I call this the Pandora's Box, the African American Male Edition, because I'm a large man, in case you can't say, 208 pounds, 5'11", with dreadlocks. So oftentimes in this work with partners that I have to deal with, or that I deal with, I have to shrink myself. I have to lighten my voice. I can never seem passionate or emotional. When I prepare for my drive to work, I have to take my dreads back, make sure that they're not visible from the road. I'm in a rural area, so I have to drive through certain towns. Certain towns I do not drive through. I have to take the same route every day. Certain stores I'll stop at, certain stores I do not. Whenever I am driving, I have to make sure that I do not stand out. I'm not allowed to show emotion. Any emotion like anger or passion or frustration, and I become the angry black man, and my words are no longer heard. I'm dismissed as being just another angry black man. Next slide, please. We're gonna hang there for just a moment. I'm sorry, go back to the previous slide for just a moment. Let's hang there for just a moment. Okay, we had the George Floyd situation occurred, and we called together a meeting. The Racial Equity Subcommittee came together. The North Carolina Coalition called us together for a meeting. We came together and we sat and we talked on Zoom, of course. And I was very surprised because our subcommittee is made up of all races. We have, it's not predominantly black, it's not all black. And I was very surprised that when we had the meeting, that the only people who were on the call, other than the NCCH staff, they all looked like me. It was an open space with no agenda. And because of that, we were able to speak our mind and kind of open the box a little bit. That has always been an issue. You don't open the box in public, and those who look like me understand. You have to keep these things bottled in, and you have to keep them closed inside the box in order to be able to function and to be able to be effective in what you're doing. Well, that day we opened the box. I'm gonna try to be as very brief as possible, but I also want to make this thing live for you. In that room, I felt despair, anger, sadness, weighed down, hopeless, helpless, frustrated. And by the way, did I mention angry? As we were sitting in the room, we talked about it, and it came up, the frustration being that his murder is going to be explained away. It'll just be just another murder. They'll make some excuses as to why he was killed. Some of the excuses that were thrown out in the room was he was being disrespectful. He has a record, so, you know, it is what it is. He was intimidating. He was a large man, or my personal favorite, he was a threat. As we sat in that room, we talked together. We vented our frustrations. We cried. We were able to be angry in public without being judged. And then one of the members, who's a pastor, paused and prayed. And we closed the meeting. Out of that meeting, though, once we finished that, we came back together. You can go to the next slide, please. We came together and we set up the Racial Equity Dialogue Series, touching on these topics. We planned the dialogue series, and the staff came together, and the ad hoc group came together, and we came to the larger group and with a group of presenters, and we contacted speakers. We developed questions to facilitate the panel, and each panel included both subcommittee members and outside experts as panelists. The goal of the dialogue series was to look at the intersection of systems, knowing that homelessness doesn't exist in a vacuum, and that racism in the homeless system does not exist in a silo. Disparities in police violence and criminal justice system, education, and political disenfranchisement all impact the homeless system. We were able to get some very eloquent speakers to come in and speak during this series. It was moderated by C4 Innovations. And we were able to get Dr. Derek Hicks from Wake Forest University. We were able to get a judge, Judge Cabbage, who's a Superior Court judge who at the time was running for the appeals court as well. And we were able to get Mr. Courtney Patterson, who was one of our local elected officials at the local Board of Elections officials. Each panel averaged over about 50 participants in the panels, and the impact was measured by a survey that was sent out to all participants. The survey results were overwhelmingly positive, and respondents noted that they started conversations in their own communities, in their own workplace, and with their families and with their friends, and it kind of developed a life of its own. Next slide, please. We know that there's more work for us to do. After this, we polled our the participants, and we asked them some of the things that they wanted. So we know our subcommittee still has some things to do. We're working, of course, on improving the racial equity assessment for our COC, in addition to conducting an assessment of racial disparity in our system using the HUD Continuum of Care Racial Equity Assessment Tool and National Alliance's Homeless Race Equity Tool as well. And this year we'll be deepening our analysis by incorporating data from HUD's Stella P system as well as comparative data for our coordinated entry system and our back at home response for COVID-19. I wanted to kind of spend a little time. I wanted to get the slides finished, to be honest, so that I could spend just a little time on the event that we had. And I'll be very, very brief, and I'll yield my time at the end back. But something we did in our meeting, I would like to do here for just a moment. And that was, whenever the murders of George Floyd occurred, we researched the names of other people who had been murdered as well. Because one of our biggest topics that we discussed was the issue with policing and persons who had been murdered by police. So one of the rallying cries was, say their names. So if I could, I would like to read their names. If you would just indulge me for just a moment to read their names. Ma'Khia Bryant, Matthew Williams, Dante Wright, James Lionel Johnson, Dominique Williams, Marvin Scott, Jadwan Donald, Patrick Warren, Xavier Hill, Robert Howard, Vincent Bellamont, Benny Edwards, Casey Goodson Jr., Aiden Ellison, Quawan Charles, Kevin Peterson Jr., Walter Wallace Jr., Jonathan Price, Kurt Reinhold, Dejon Kizzy, Damian Daniels, Anthony McLean, Julian Lewis, Maurice Abasidio, Rashard Brooks, Priscilla Slater, Robert Forbes, Kamal Flowers, Jamil Floyd, David McCanty, James Sherlock, Calvin Horton Jr., Tony McDade, Deion Johnson, George Floyd, Maurice Gordon, Cornelius Fredericks, Stephen Taylor, Daniel Pruitt, Breonna Taylor, Barry Gidias, Manuel Ellis, Ahmaud Arbery, Lionel Morris, Jaquan O'Neal Light, and William Green. Thank you so much. I yield to Darryl.
Thanks, thank you. And also like to say thank you to Sean, but thanks Jeffrey for really highlighting what's going on in our country and what has gone on. And I'm definitely going to take a little bit from both people that have spoken and kind of talk about how we're moving this pendulum forward. And I want to first give a little background that my name is Darryl Vincent. I work with US Vets for the last 18 years. We have several locations across the nation that present unique challenges as well as responsibilities because we're in different geographics, demographics all across the country, which allows us to be diverse by accident, not necessarily by purpose. And I think that's the thing that we're talking about moving forward is how do we make purposeful decisions and being deliberate. And I'm honored to be here speaking with Jeffrey and Sean and moving this pendulum forward to make sure that we are addressing the social inequities and racial injustice that come across this country that inevitably affect our veterans as well. Next slide. Now, needless to say, the fact that we're sitting in front of the screen in 2020 and not sitting with each other speaks to the fact of how March 2020 to now has been just one year that we can either say it's been a challenge. Without challenge, we would not know the next step. But the reality of the situation, we would be together. And if that wasn't enough, as Jeffrey just pointed out greatly, we had COVID and then we had to deal with the social unrest. And the social unrest and the murder of George Floyd divided our country. And I think that was just illustrated. It's not here for me to tell you what side that you fall on. All I can tell you is that if veterans are suffering any kind of discrimination simply by the base of their color of their skin, their culture, their ethnicity, then it's up for all of us to solve. We no longer can say we stand for the veterans and work for the veterans. We don't solve the social inequities and discrimination this country has done in the past years, and yet say we stand with the veterans. As you will see on the slide, and as Sean pointed out, over 2/3 of the veterans that we serve are of color and homeless. 2/3. That's extremely disproportionate to the total amount of veteran population. This is not by accident. This is by institutional, historic, systemic discrimination and bias. And we first must acknowledge this without any ambiguity in order to address it. And we also need to say that it's not any one person's fault, but it's all about responsibility. And that's the difference. A lot of times we get into rooms and people feel guilty about this. If we're not being uncomfortable, then we're not making change. So we want to say there's no one person's fault. It's everyone's responsibility. And US Vets has chosen to address this head on. We don't see this as a Republican or Democratic issue, a black or white issue, a gay or straight issue. We see this as a human issue, right or wrong. And as long as we all can agree on those terms, and I'm imagining everyone in this call, not everyone's a veteran, probably 1/3, even less than that, we're probably formerly homeless veterans, but yet every day we come together and serve homeless veterans with empathy. How do we do that? Yet all of us were never homeless veterans. So you cannot tell me we cannot join the cause together and make something happen. If we could put our man on the moon, we can solve racial discrimination. It's a choice. So the demographics you see, I don't have to read them over. You can see them. It's time for us to address this age-old problem, because if you have a pandemic or health disparities, when you have a national crisis or a global crisis, the marginalized population feels it even more. If upper middle class and middle class catches a cold, marginalized people catch the flu. And we need to understand that it's time for us to address that. And our veteran population is part of that. Next slide. So, as I pointed out, it's our responsibility to act. We were blessed and lucky, thanks to our development team. Many of my US Vets colleagues are on this call, the executive directors across the nation, all 11 of them, my development department, my CEO, Steve Peck. we decided that we went for a grant and partnered with Boeing, and Boeing wanted to help us to help African-American veterans or veterans of color get employed. Pretty simple, something that we do anyway. We could do that and say, okay, give us the funds, we'll make sure that we help them with these things. But we saw this as a direct opportunity of how we can train our staff, how we can make sure that we are understanding what it truly means, not just saying, let's just find some veterans that are minorities and give them some jobs. We wanted to make sure our partners and how we can understand and address this problem systematically. Because I think a lot of times when we work in the social work field, we do these things called workarounds. Workarounds is the system is not working, but I know this person's sitting over here, so I can call them and they'll get them through the system, but that never really changes the system. And that's the problem that has always been occurred in a lot of facets. As Jeffrey pointed out, a lot of people wanted to talk about the response to the protests. Whether you stand on what side of the fence you stand on, it doesn't matter to me. What matters is when people continually say, turn the other cheek, I always tell them, just tell them don't hit us in the first place. Then that would be where we start. That's the action. So the action of changing the system is how do we change the system from within? And the only way you do that, I challenge anyone on this call to tell me the one time we've changed anything in this country without unrest. Our whole country was based on the Revolutionary War. Unrest is how you make things change. It doesn't have to be violent all the time. That's not what I'm promoting. But I'm saying if you're not making people uncomfortable, if you're not addressing it, if you're not taking opportunities such as we're doing with Boeing to say, yes, we can employ 40 veterans, but you know what? There's a bigger picture here. And Boeing was so ecstatic. They're like, yes, if you're willing to expand this, we would love it. Can you tell us what you're going to do? So I like to say, we want to change the system. We just don't want to employ 40 veterans and say, we did our job. Thank you, Boeing. Give us something, give us the money. We'll do that because we do that anyway. So what are we really trying to change? Next slide. So we did a comprehensive approach. We took this and said, you know what? There's some money in this pot that we can put into training, or we can actually say a smart man doesn't not only know what he knows what he does not know. It wasn't up to us to grab all the minority veterans in our organization and say, okay, let's create a program simply because we're a minority. Now, we may understand our truth, our plight, our story, and we should be adding to that. But there are actual people that do this for a living. This is what they do. They went to school, they were trained for it. They understand when you say DEI, what does that mean? How do you change the system? How do you do these things? So we wanted to have some clear objectives of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion in our organization, because we knew we were diverse, because we're in 6 different places, and we're definitely more women dominated in the social work field. We have minorities, but we can honestly say, to be transparent, we did it just because of accident. We hired the best person for the job, and it happened to be those people. It wasn't purposeful. It wasn't deliberate. It wasn't saying we need to make sure that we're having this. So it gave me a new lens to say, how do I make sure that I'm being deliberate in this, and not just saying, well, we're making sure that we're diverse so we can accurately reflect the population that we serve. So we wanted to talk about staff training, volunteer leadership, client impact, and most importantly, one of the more important things when you change the system, we want to adopt this to have part of our strategic plan. It's called putting your money where your mouth is. Everyone talks about, hey, let's be diverse, let's do this. Who's willing to put those words in their plan and say, this is what we're doing. We're not going to hide from it. We're going to say, this is what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. Next slide, please. So we took advantage of the funding interest to basically, how can we change what we do in our organization as staff? I think the next slide will say it, and I'll say it ahead of time, is I'm a firm believer coming from a programmatic system, and that's what my thing is I like to do, to run operations, make sure programs and systems are working, is the therapeutic approach never works if you're not modeling the behavior you're trying to teach. Every community, you cannot sit, when staff is working in a residential setting such as us, we cannot walk around and act like we're different or we are not a part of that community. We're working where their home is. So how can you say you're excluded from that? How can we say be diverse, help each other, teach each other, make sure that you're policing each other? How can we say that if we're not doing it ourselves? So we can easily say, well, let's make sure that we're employing these veterans, but what if the organization is not doing it? What if we're not practicing diversity at the higher levels or equity or inclusion? Are we sitting at the table saying who's not sitting here, not being representative? Because what we've learned through our trainings is the more people at the table, the better your organization is. The more ideas at the table, the better your organization. It's been proven through systematic approaches and through data that you have a more high excelling company when you have more diversity sitting in that room, because now you have different people from different ethnics, and not saying, well, I just want to treat everybody the same. Treating everyone the same is equality. We want to talk about equity. I don't want people to look at someone and say, well, I don't see color. We want you to see color, because then you're saying you're not seeing me. You need to see who I am. See who I am. This is where I'm representing, and this is what we want to bring to the table. I'm saying all this to say that I'm extremely blessed to work in an organization that has allowed me to speak this freely. And that's why it's so important, that we'll talk about later, but Jeffrey pointed out earlier as well, is important to have allies for people that are sitting on the call saying, well, I'm uncomfortable. I don't want to talk about these things. No major change has ever happened without allies. You can no longer ask the minority to change the problems of the majority. It's just unreasonable. Solve our problems for us. No, we can help. Join us, and we do it together. So we're not looking to exclude, we're looking to include, and it's okay to have a difference of opinion. I think everyone on the call that works with me, my team, if they're on the call, they're probably chuckling saying, I love having I say fight, they say discussion. Let's have the fight about what's right. Let's be more invested in getting it right than being right. So let's have that fight, because then we walk out the room, we have the best ideas. How can you have the best ideas if you only have one representation? You just cannot. So we wanted to talk about how we're going to do that with our partners. Next slide. So first and foremost, what we did is we hired a national director of workforce programs. Many people that run homeless programs or veterans experiencing homelessness programs, the HVRP grant, we have a CDI grant, Call of Duty. These are grants that help us help veterans that are getting out of the military, that are experiencing homelessness, get them back to work. I think a lot of us are familiar with that. But we never, as an organization, brought that all together to put it under one umbrella to say, we want to have one person that's guiding that, and guiding that in an equitable manner. A lot of times people get confused when affirmative action came out and when people started targeting minorities, that they thought it was unfair. And the reality is that everything that's being created systematically is called opportunity and access. That's what we're trying to promote, is that people should have the same opportunity and same access regardless of the color of their skin or their cultural background or their sexual orientation. So what we said is we want to have a national director for a workforce program that is going to focus on the Boeing grant, but how can she focus on that, or he, and it's a she, how can she focus on that? And this is the purpose of it, without also being included in our DEI initiative. We want to make sure that we're doing it the right way. So we hired that person, and it's not only to increase employment, but to actually develop opportunities for their career. We don't want to get people jobs, we want to put them on a career path, and we don't make sure we remove the barriers for them to go to work that's sometimes not allowed in the grants. A lot of times the grants, and rightfully so, they're outcome based on, did they get a job placement? What's the job placement? And I would love to start seeing more grants where the outcome is, are they placed in a training career path, that they complete a class, that they complete the next class, and then do longitudinal data that they completed and what was their job after that. But we're so in the moment. We want the 1 year, employ 100 veterans, get them done, and you're putting veterans in jobs that are not their careers. And yes, you can say, well, it's good, they're learning things, but how many of us know you want to work in a job that you really want to do something and you do a better job at it when you do your strengths? There's a saying, if you find a job you love, you never work a day in your life. I say that's ridiculous. If you find a job that you love, you just don't mind working as hard. You work hard and the tools are just a little more light in your hand because you love what you do. I think all the colleagues on here from US Vets will say, I love my job, but yes, I work hard. It's not that I don't work a day in my life. We do. Next slide. So we started having conversations. As Jeff pointed out, Jeffrey, it was an emotional time when the George Floyd murder happened. It took me a week before I could address the staff nationally with the video that is for public consumption. It's on YouTube. I want to again give credit to my boss, Steve Peck, who is not of color, but was an ally when I asked, is it okay if I address our staff about where US stands with this thing? I feel compelled to do it. Compelled that if my father can march in civil rights, this is the least I can do. If the things that they've done, I owe that I need to do this. And Steve wrote a letter and I did a video. And we didn't sanitize it. We didn't try to make it, oh, it's okay. It was not okay. and it drew emotion and invoked emotion in everyone. We had tears, people cried, we hugged each other, we spoke about it, and it made it even more amplified because it was COVID, so it had to be done remotely. We weren't allowed to be able to invade each other's presence, but we did the best we could. I asked all the executive directors across the nation to sit with their team and have an open discussion. And I want to make sure everybody understands, even for those that don't necessarily feel affected by it. There are many people that get offended when they hear Black Lives Matter. There are many people that get offended when they hear these things that are going on, as Jeffrey pointed out, as five two polarities are standing across from each other. We weren't here to convince anyone of what's right or wrong in that case. We were here to say, here's your venue to talk about it, so we can put it on the table, so we can address it, because that's what helps is dialogue. And we did have some people that did not understand. We did have some people that were like, well, you know, this happened, that happened, because they didn't come from that culture or understand, even though you can see it on TV, people still, as you can see on TV, people still will defend it sometimes. To me, it's the difference between right and wrong. And if you can just stay on that path, then we can talk about those other things and get intertwine them. So all the executive directors, and you're seeing a few pictures of them, they were allowed to have a meeting with their staff and do follow-up meetings to literally open the door and just say, there's a lot going on in our country right now. Let's talk about it. The feedback was enormous. I've never worked for a company that allowed us to talk honestly about it. It made it a safe place. It made me feel like, okay, it's okay to hurt. It's okay for me not to understand. It's okay for me to not even relate. It's okay for me to feel like I have white privilege, but I don't know what that means. And I'm sad, I'm sorry that you're telling me about this. All these new terminologies that are out that are causing emotion, it doesn't help if you bury them. You have to talk about them, and you have to have a company that's willing to say, talk about it. It's okay. You know, I know everyone has to put HR in the corner and say, okay, watch us, make sure we don't get in trouble. Well, I say, have the conversation. You know, have the conversation. Be genuine to your heart and you're true to your heart, and let the chips fall where they may. As long as you're not offending anyone, and I trusted the 11 executive directors that work with me, that they know how to do that, and they did it in spades. So that's what we did. We have a new HR director in charge of national. He turned us on to a DEI certification program for the University of South Florida, I think it was. It was a 7-week program. You had to watch it, you had to take a test, you had to pass it in order to get the certificate. Doesn't mean that you're an expert in it now, but it taught me so many things. It taught me so many things about microaggression that I never paid attention to before. That when I got compliments before about, oh, you speak so well, I thought it always sounded funny to me, but I never knew how to put a label on it. Like, what was that, what they're saying? What did you expect me to sound like? What is it? Why are you saying I speak well? I finally started to put names to it. And I'm not someone that's hypersensitive, by the way. I'm a native New Yorker. I'm in Hawaii now, but I'm a native New Yorker. So I grew up in Harlem and then in Washington, D.C. So it's not like I'm sensitive to things. I can take it, understand. I have many friends across the spectrum, but I knew it didn't sit right with me. And I was trying to figure out why. And that certification told me, oh, these are the things that I have. So all it did was make me conscious. Doesn't mean I'm going to walk around like a police all the time saying, oh, you did this or you did. No, because that doesn't solve anything. What solves it is conversation. Hey, can I have a minute with you? You know, and we talk. So we did that. We have our Reliance training. We provide training to the staff with NHV, obviously, or they're all sitting on the call, or they should be in some session. And we think it's negligent of us in the community to not address also our LGBTQ plus veteran population and population in general. They should not be ignored as well. That when you start talking about discrimination and those type of things, it is time for us to understand when we fight for one, we fight for all. And that just means that we have to be able to understand that the differences is what makes us great, and we are okay with embracing those differences. And that goes all the way back to our disabled veterans and everyone else. I can't tell you how many times I think all of you know the experience of people being discriminated against simply because they're a veteran or a disabled veteran. And we have to always, it's easier to point those things out and harder sometimes to point out these things we're talking about right now. Why? Because we have a history in this country that sometimes we try to sanitize and run from. And I think that's our biggest mistake. Our biggest mistake is say, this is what it is. And Boeing is allowing us to have that voice. I know everyone wants me to circle it back to how we're making this work. Stay with me, I'm getting right there, but I just want to make sure the context is given to you, because it's not just about a grant and money. We do not chase money at US Vets. We let money chase us. We're not going to go, we're going to take, not all money is good money. We want to make sure we're making a difference. Next slide. So The grant's telling us we have to hire 40 veterans, achieve not only employment, but have a Peck of eliminating barriers. We can provide direct assistance, career access, employment opportunities. I'm not going to stay much on this slide because I think we all understand the employment game. The only difference is we get to target it. I will tell this one anecdote. In having this discussion with our staff, we had to address even some staff that were Caucasian of, well, what are we going to tell them when they say we're only going to give it to them? Like, what about veterans feel slighted? And you may think I got offended, but I didn't. I said, I want to hear those questions, because if you're thinking it, someone else is going to think it. I said, so let me ask you a question. What happens when they say we want to target women veterans? Do we tell the men, do we have to explain to the men why? When we are targeting the veterans with substance abuse problems and don't need that, do we have to explain, well, no, you should get this money too, even though you don't have a substance abuse problem, or a mental health veteran? People can see it in those lenses, but it's hard when you started getting into color. It's hard. It's hard for people to start thinking, oh, that's discrimination. That's reverse discrimination. That's a whole nother hour conversation that I don't have time for. But the bottom line is we addressed it and we said, look, this is targeting that we know we're targeting veterans that have systematically, institutionally, in every other way have been marginalized. Accept it, understand it, and now we're allowing to address it. That's it. Now we can talk about how you feel about it. Those are the facts. Next slide. So I'm going to start moving towards the conclusion. And in order to advance objectives, the one thing I learned at the DEI training is that it has to come from leadership. We can all sit around the table and feel great, and if leadership's not embracing it, then it doesn't matter. Again, I'm blessed that I have that. We are looking to diversify our board of directors. We need work on that, as well as our advisory councils, not just people and women, men of color, but veterans, formerly homeless veterans, disabled, you name it. We need proper representation. The question I asked is, some of you may be asking, well, how do you do that without, you say, the best person for the job? And my good friend and colleague now, the executive director of Houston, Audrey, he said he brought somebody to teach us how to, to have a conversation of DEI when we got this grant. And he said, well, let me ask you a question. When you apply for it, when you're posting a job, are you posting at the HBCUs, or you're posting at the Black Caucus, or you apply? He was pointing out that you don't have to necessarily try to target an individual. It's about your targeted approach of reaching where those people are and saying, now I have access and opportunity to see there's a job. I wouldn't even have known it was a job because I'm not a part of this other network. So I need to know that it's coming to me. So if you have a board of directors that's predominantly one culture, normally board of directors recruit their friends. Hey, I got a friend, he's gonna join. They're gonna recruit it. Next thing you know, you have a whole board looking alike and you didn't know how you got here. Well, because that's their network. So you have to be purposeful and say, I'm gonna address this by reaching out to the organizations that are represented by marginalized populations, disabled veterans, formerly homeless veterans, veterans of color, women veterans, LGBTQ. Not that you're targeting them because they're that. You're giving them access in their community, because not every veteran of color wants to be working for us. We're not saying we have to. There's got to be someone that has that goal and drive that wants to do that. So it requires us to take a hard look at ourselves. And not everyone likes to do that. Not everyone likes to look at it and say, man, we were doing this wrong. It's okay. Last time I checked, we all don't do everything right all the time. So let's just be like, hey, it's okay. We're not there yet. The fact that we're looking at it and owning it, I'm very proud of our organization for doing that. Next up. So you may say, well, how are you gonna make the change across the nation? You spread across. It should be from bottom up, not top down. Top down has to make the environment okay for it to happen. Top down. But in order to get input, how do you reach that? We're spread over everywhere. I gave a mandate to the executive directors. Your job is to meet with an open forum, whoever wants to come. We're gonna add a strategic plan. We're gonna add a goal about racial diversity, inclusion, equity. We're gonna add something. And we want you to be a part of that. Each executive director had an open forum where 20, 30, 40, 100 can come, whoever wants to come. They took the working thing that we had, the working statement, they wordsmithed it. Then they came up with objectives to reach that goal. That's gonna be a part of our strategic plan. They send it to me, we're gonna have an open forum. They get 4 representatives to come to a meeting. We're gonna all get on Zoom. Each location, that's gonna be over 60 people. We're gonna divide into groups. We're gonna talk about it. We're gonna wordsmith it. We're gonna come up with, we all agree. We want proper representation. Because we have sites in Washington, D.C., all the way to Hawaii, we get diversity just because, but we're going to actually target it and make sure that they're in that group. We're going to do all those things, and then my job is to submit it to my boss, Steve Peck, who will then submit it to the board and say, we want this in our strategic plan. That's how you have a opportunity, and you take that opportunity, you go to the trenches to where the people are actually doing it. You get their input, and you work its way back up. And it's going to be comprised of every site, every ethnicity, every demographic that we have in our program. People were jumping. We had to contain it to only 4 to site because everyone wants to be involved. So the way they can get involved is at the site, and just like Congress, we send 2 people to Congress to represent you. But in this case, they're really going to represent us. Okay, next slide. So I already went through that. We're going to prioritize it and make it goal focused and make sure that we are going to add it. We want to make sure it's for African-American veterans, minority veterans, staff volunteers, in everyone. And it's going to continue to broaden. And we're not telling you this is our last stop. It's not. We'll continue going on after that as well. This will just be where we're at today. Next slide. So this is the working strategic plan goal. Then we'll have objectives underneath this. But it's the working one that's being wordsmithed across the nation as we speak. U.S. Vet seeks to advance racial equality, diversity, and inclusion for our staff and veterans we serve, to incorporate equality in our policy, decision-making, and programs, and directly increase opportunities for people of color and other minority veteran populations. You tell them from New York now, right? Talk pretty fast. Next slide. So the gentleman on the left is a young, dashing myself, an Air Force Junior ROTC. The gentleman in the middle is me when I joined the Marine Corps, and the gentleman on the right is my oldest son, who said, "Dad, I'm going to beat your accomplishments by 20 times fold." And he graduated West Point last year, and he's moved on in aviation school. Proud of him. He is all of us had this conversation, single dad, live in Hawaii, and we've had this conversation. In the video you can see on YouTube, we talk about this, how I sat down with both of my sons and talked about the discrimination that's gone on in our country and the things they need to do. And unfortunately, what Jeffrey pointed out is the conversation we continue to have, that we shouldn't have to have. What do you do when you get pulled over? This is what you do. This is what you say. This is how you get it. The most important one that stuck with me: you need to work twice as hard. You do not have a chance. You make up one mistake, you're done. These are the things that are ingrained in us that unfortunately is not necessarily fair, but we deal with it. I'm not blaming anyone in this call. No one in this call should feel bad about what I'm saying. Uncomfortable, maybe, but not bad. It is all our responsibility to change this. And US Vets is taking the platform of Boeing, a grant to employ 40 veterans, which we can do in our sleep. We said, no, this is bigger than that. Let's change our system. Let's change who we are. Let's change it so we can model the behavior we want to be. We ask you to join in that cause with us across the nation. And I think together, we all can tackle this thing. If not our generation behind us will see it. Thank you for your time.
I have to say, I'm taking a minute and pausing. Sean, Jeffrey, and Darryl, I just want to thank all 3 of you. We do have some questions, but I just want to take a moment to thank you all for your honesty and your openness. We have quite a few comments coming into the question box, specifically, Jeffrey, around your comments, and I'll send some of those to you individually. But I did want to read one of them just for the group because I feel like it's something that everyone needs to hear. And this was when you were talking about the Pandora's box and having to hide your true self and keep bottled up and shrink. And I even noticed after you said that, I noticed that even now you're not sitting up to your full stature in the webcam. I can see that. And it just, to me, shows that that's been ingrained in you since you were probably a child. And so that you're still trying to make yourself smaller, even on the camera. And I noticed it when you did make yourself bigger and then you sort of shrank back again. So, but this comment came from Melissa, and she said, "I 100% know you have to shrink yourself as African-American males, and I hate it so much. I am white and grew up as the minority in my neighborhood. I was always treated as family in the homes I went to. I never learned to feel uncomfortable or to feel threatened by other races because I was the minority. I felt more at home where I grew up than anywhere I had ever been." And that's a sort of opposite experience that that Melissa felt, being a member of the majority culture in a minority environment. The exact opposite of how you described. And I think just an example of sort of the the realization, the truth that you spoke and how it touched other folks in the room. So I wanted to share that one specifically before we got into some other questions. There's a couple of others that'll come through, but I do have a very practical, tangible question going back to Sean's comments about the dashboard. And I think the question is really about, I think you mentioned that it's going to be specifically for VA staff initially, but there's a question about when and if VSOs will have access to some of that information to help them in their work and planning.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I don't have a great timeline on that yet. We are working with a variety of different priorities in regards to using information to help inform operations. So this particular dashboard is kind of in line with that. Our desire, our longer term desire is, of course, to get this information as much as we can out in a publicly available way so that communities can be able to use this to improve their efforts. So it's one of those things where I apologize that I don't have a good time frame on. It's something that we know. Your question is not the first person exploring interest in having this publicly available. So it is something on the horizon. I don't have a time frame for that, but we definitely have an eye for getting as much of the lessons, the insights, the information out into the public so that you can benefit from some of the things that we're learning from as well.
Great. Thank you, Sean. This next question is for all three of you, so you can sort of take turns and decide who wants to go first. But what do you believe is the role of privilege in the transition from military to civilian life for veterans? And then sort of parenthetically, how might that impact homelessness? It's a big question, but I thought it's a very good question. So I'm not sure who wants to try and tackle that one first.
I mean, I might take a stab at it and then klutz my way through it. I think I want to take a step back and kind of acknowledge that when you think about privilege and oppression, that these might be kind of two different poles on a spectrum. But for any individual person, I want to kind of maybe broaden our concept and think that each individual may have multiple dimensions of privilege and multiple dimensions of oppression, and that they kind of work together in some kind of weird algorithm or math that the individual ends up where they are. So what's an example of that? I'm a person of color, so to a certain degree, I'm half Black, I'm half Asian. My Black side is more predominantly oppressed, my Asian side less so. I'm also a male, so that's actually a bit of privilege that balances into there as well. I come from a middle-class family. I am a grandchild of a veteran. So that actually gives me a little bit of privilege, but I am also the first generation of an immigrant. So there's a potential little bit of oppression. It's when you start thinking about how, and this is essentially intersectionality that I'm getting at, when you start thinking about all of the different ways your identity, your history, your culture, your upbringing, they work together and kind of in the final analysis, kind of influence how you engage with the world, I think it can be kind of tricky. And so the thing when we talk about veterans exiting the service, being discharged from service, and then what are the circumstances or factors that may predispose them or protect them from becoming homeless, I think we also, in addition to race, need to think about all of those different components as well, right? Darryl said earlier, and Jeffrey as well, right? A lot of times these conversations focus on male veterans. What about our women veterans? What about our women veterans? What about our LGBTQ, our trans veterans, right? Those different components as well may add privilege or maybe add oppression to their experience. And I think where we are in this area right now in this conversation is maybe taking a moment to just respect that the situation for each individual veteran may be way more complex than we anticipated.
I couldn't echo it any better, except for to say when I hear about the privilege conversation, I always try to make sure that everyone's aware of it's not something to have to be ashamed about. It's just something to be acknowledged. I think the best analogy I gave was with homeless veterans in general, or just veterans experiencing homelessness and the people on this call and us individuals. The opportunity and access we have because we have a home. Let's just keep it that way. We have a home, we're living in a home, and we have opportunity and access to certain things because we have a home. That makes us privileged in a certain extent to get those opportunities. Now, What do we do to make sure that people have those equal opportunity access and use my privilege to help that? What do? I include them. I hear the dialogue. I empathize. I don't combat it. I don't come from a place of guilt of, well, just get hard to work. What's the problem? You know, things are okay now. I don't do that. That's what desynthesizes things, and relationships are the #1 things that forge moving forward in any culture. If law changed culture, we should be fine since 1964 when the Civil Rights Act was built. We should have been fine. Law doesn't change culture. Culture is changed by people working with each other and understanding each other. Law enforces it if it's done correctly. So I think it's important for us to have legislative change. I think it's important for us to have systematic change, but it's also equally important, we're talking in our living rooms and our dining rooms, that we know that we have allies. I'm an ally of the LGBTQ community. I have no problem with my friends across the spectrums that I want to be disabled veterans across the spectrum. And if I can have some sort of privilege because I'm in this position at US Vets, in an executive position, even as a man of color, I'm going to use that privilege in my position to do that, which has been done across this country for years with other things. So I think sometimes when I hear privilege, I try to desynthesize it and say, stop, don't feel guilty about it. And how does it affect the homeless veterans? Is that we need to know when we're discharging veterans with the VA or coming out, we should know that these are the things they're going to address and stop trying to act like it's not there. That's the problem, I feel, is sometimes addressing and acknowledging the discrimination that occurs without any ambiguity, and now you can address it and stop placing fault versus responsibility. That's how I try to solve it.
We're going to possibly.
Thank you so much. Jeffrey, did you want to talk about that one, or are you good?
Good. What can I possibly add to that? That was excellent.
So I have a couple more practical questions, I think, and then there's a bunch of other sort of deeper questions. And I will say that we've gotten quite a few comments saying that this conversation was refreshing and inspiring. So again, thank you all for that. Practical question for Jeffrey. As you guys were responding to the George Floyd killing and starting to well, you had sort of started it right before that, right? With your building in equity into the COC scoring process. Was there resistance to that? And are there practical suggestions you could give to other folks who are trying to make similar changes within their COCs, within their systems?
Okay. At the steering committee, there was not much resistance at all. Given the climate, it actually was the silver lining in all of this, was that it brought a lot of people to the table, people who were at the table. It opened their eyes and they became a little more understanding. We had to approach it in a non-confrontational way, for one thing. We had to make sure that we were going, and we were looking for partners. We didn't want to go in bullying. So we put our suggestions together, we put what we wanted to do, and we brought it to them, and let them review it and let them kind of tweak it where it needed to be the case. And then we brought it back to the full committee, to the full steering committee, for them to vote. And there was no dissension, period. So we had I've heard from a couple of members privately that there was some issue with it that they had, but for the overall committee, there was no resistance.
Great, thank you. A similar kind of question for Darryl and US Vets. Was there, as you were sort of promoting these uncomfortable conversations, was there any pushback that was geographically related? I know you said that you had very different sites at US Vets. Was there any correlation with some sites being more open to these conversations and others less so? And you don't have to name names, but how did you sort of deal with that that difference in sort of openness to having maybe openness and also comfort with leading these conversations and engaging in these conversations?
So excellent question. And without naming names, the reality, some of our sites had when the social unrest came from the murder of George Floyd, which prompted us having these open discussions, they were literally a block away from the uprisings. I mean, it was right there. We had to hire security. We had to make sure the site remained safe. We had to implement some things with the veterans just to ensure safety, because people, staff, and site was finished. So obviously those conversations were different than the conversations we were having. And I can name to say Hawaii. While Hawaii, we did have peaceful protests. We did. We did address it. We did meet with them, and people were affected, because as we talked about this, we also didn't address the Asian hate stuff, the situation that came after that as well, which Hawaii is predominantly has a big Asian population. What I found to be very effective is that we have very skilled executive directors in facilitating discussions that allow for safety and in implementing practical measures that allow people to feel safe, because the number one thing is people feeling safe, not only physically, but emotionally and mentally. And how we address that in the sites that were having predominantly an impact, I mean, a big impact on what was going on right outside their doorstep, was the pushback wasn't so much of, we don't agree with this. Their pushback was more of, are we safe? What are we living in? It was like, oh, how do we manage this? How do we do this? And then we have sites, without naming them, that tend to lean towards a more conservative approach in looking at the response versus what actually took place. How we addressed that was allowing that space to be spoken about without chastising, and just saying, reality is reality. This is what took place. This is the reaction. How do we ensure that we, meaning we at this site today, remain safe? We didn't make it a big picture. We tried to narrow it down to bite-sized chunks at that time, saying today and tomorrow, we're going to make sure that you're heard. We're going to make sure that you're safe. And we will make sure you know that your opinion counts no matter what your opinion is, regardless of what the resistance is. People were already working in a flexible schedule already. They were working 1 day, 1 week at home, 1 week in the office. If somebody felt some kind of way, maybe they get to work from home more and talk about it and be able to process through that. So we took an individualized approach if people had resistance, but also as things became more healed and people got comfortable, we were able to have those conversations that were more challenging. Of when a person says something and another one doesn't agree with, it's not about fighting them, because arguing is that you need to listen to me and I need to convince you, versus sharing. Share what you feel, you share what you feel. This is what we're understanding. You could still stay in your corner, I could still stay in mine. At least I understand you and you understand me. That's the only way we know how to address it. And by no means were we experts in it. And that's why we're hiring a DEI officer. And I don't know if I said that in the presentation, but part of the Boeing grant is we're hiring somebody to do this. They're going to be the one that makes sure that does the grant and make sure that gets into the groups and make sure that we're being diversified in equity and inclusion and what that means and how we work with each other. So really just spearheaded that conversation. As we did it informally, we want someone to do it formally that has that kind of education.
Great, thank you. Our next practical question sort of is for Sean. And this is a broader VA, so you may not be able to answer it, but I'm still going to throw it out there anyway. So the question is, since justice-involved veterans are disproportionately minorities, specifically African-American males, how is the VA going to work to bolster their veteran justice outreach program in the area of racial equity when it comes to serving veterans in the criminal justice system? The program historically has staffing issues, and at least in this person's perspective, the VA doesn't put as much attention into the services and support of this program, which often serves some of these veterans of color that we're talking about.
Yeah, this is a really great question, and I can speak on it a little bit with some relatively timely updates. I think the first thing that I want to acknowledge that nationally and a lot of times locally, our justice programs are aligned underneath nationally the Homeless Programs Office, and a lot of times, very commonly, either at the VISN level, but most often at the facility level within homeless programs. So there's actually a lot of synergy already taking place. You should also know I am one of our co-leads of our National Racial Equity Work Group. My other co-lead, a wonderful human named Matt Stimmel, is the National Training Coordinator for our Veterans Justice Programs. So we actually have our co-lead as a member of the justice programs in terms of training, helping us think through all of these different frameworks. One other thing that I can mention is that we're looking at developing a variety of different partnerships with different veteran service organizations and other stakeholders across the country, specifically tailored to increasing access to not only healthcare services for veterans who are justice involved, but also getting them more connected in VA healthcare as well. And one of the things that we recognize is that not only do our Black veterans disproportionately represented in the justice system, but new information to me that veterans of varying minority identities are more likely to have bad paper discharges or other discharges that may preclude them from VA healthcare, right? So this is a topic that's actually also very timely, even within the context of the racial equity work group that we're working on. So we are looking at it. It's some of the things that I hope at a future conference, I'll have more updates to share about some of the interventions that have emerged, but we are definitely taking a look at that one.
Thank you so much, Sean. Didn't mean to put you on the spot, but I knew you had some answer for that. So before I forget, I'm just going to move the slide so folks can see your contact information, because we've had a number of requests for it. And I think I've got everybody's, Jeffrey, yours is in a slightly different format, but your email is still there. So folks were asking for contact information, so I wanted to get that out there. We have another question. And that is, and I think this may be, just looking at the time, it'll give you each a chance to answer, and it may be our last one. If we have more, if we have time, we'll do another one. But understanding that there is a systemic issue creating a large gap between African American veteran homelessness compared disproportionately to the statistics of overall veteran homelessness, what forms of reconciliation in terms of resources can best address this gap? So what do you think, and I know I can see the thoughts, it's a big question, so I'm stalling a little bit to give you guys a time to think of an answer, doing my best, but I think it is a big question, and at least an important one to ask, even if we don't have all the answers. I think that's part of today's discussion, right? Asking the questions and opening up the conversation. So hopefully I stalled enough there to let someone can start answering that question.
Yeah, I might give it a start, and then my colleagues will maybe join in. You know, so essentially what we're looking at, especially if you think back to the chart that I showed where we looked at the population comparisons of all veterans per the AHAR, and then veterans served by VHA homeless programs, Black veterans in particular having pretty good access to our programs. One of the things that we think is going on and that we might have to get ahead of are essentially, you know, working on that difference between the gray bar and the red bar, veterans experiencing homelessness, falling into homelessness. Our response is pretty good, but we may have an obligation as a community, as a country, to start going further upstream and identifying really, really, really effective prevention interventions. Prevention interventions, I mean, definitely, eviction prevention is fantastic. Paying past rent, paying utilities is fantastic. But really starting to think, explore, and learn about some of the other upstream drivers. Criminal justice may be an issue. Other kind of neighborhood or community-based things may be an also issue, so that we can actually stem the tide of veterans falling in. VA has done, we have some services already, many of you know SSVF in regards to prevention resources, but what I'm imagining, and we're definitely interested in your insights as time goes on, are what are some of those other opportunities for upstream? When I say upstream, I mean further, way before they ever knock on a door of a shelter or call a national call center, way before that, so that we can provide interventions there that ultimately would prevent them from falling into homelessness. That's still something I think as a country, as a service sector, we're starting to figure out. Interventions are emerging, and so I'm excited to where we go, but we cannot just simply wait for the interventions. We've got to continue to think about it and reflect and test out stuff.
So I think we all recognize that change can come at 3 different levels of legislative, regulatory, or programmatic, and most of us work on the programmatic level. I'm assuming Sean has worked with the VA, so he may be involved in some of the regulatory changes. You know, programmatic, we usually can make happen, you know, pretty quickly, depending on the organization. It doesn't do anything. Regulatory doesn't take an act of Congress, but it takes as long as to a legislative, which is legislative literally takes an act of Congress, right? So those are the 3 things. So I think it's equal responsibility by all 3 tiers. So the first tier, when we say programmatic, I will say with community. If we know we have a targeted population that is automatically disproportionate, it's more than likely to experience this. So we know it going in already. We don't have to guess at it. This is the data. This is what it says we were going to do. And as Sean pointed out about prevention, what are we doing? So some of it has to come from internal. You see the pen, for those that are on the camera, I'm a member of the greatest fraternity in the world. It's called Alpha Phi Alpha. My friend Roy is on the call. I know he's a Omega Psi Phi, and Anthony Love is a friend of mine, is Omega Psi Phi. We're very happy to lead the way for you too, as we will. And the reality is that that's just a joke for Greek humor. But what I'm saying is that programmatically, we have to systematically help. When you start having people in position of authority, for lack of a better word, or position, I don't like to say the word power, but position to make things happen. It is our job to reach back into the community and involve those people to help with those resources. I can't tell you how many resources I've reached through my fraternity, through church, through organizations, because it's a big brother helping you. It's a big brother advancing you. We say reach one, teach one. So that's the programmatic level. That's not the only level though, but I'm just saying that's something that has to do. We have to know proportionate wise, how do we create things? Most fraternities, most organizations of color were only formed because we weren't allowed to join the other ones. That's the reason why they were formed in the first place. That's why HBCUs were formed. So what happens is you have to create a network of those people saying, this is what we're facing. How do we help each other as we grow? As we become in positions of authority, as we do these, how are we making sure we're doing those things? And that's the responsibility my father put into me of why I find it so important. Obviously, regulatory, Sean just talked about, is how you start taking regulations and really looking at it and saying this is a target population. This is what we're going to go after. This is what we're going to do. And then obviously legislative, they've talked about it for years. Whether you believe in reparations or not, or affirmative action, I'm not into what it is. I am into legislative actually being true to what it is and saying, we know this is a problem. How can we make sure the laws support changing the culture to endure by putting our money where our mouth is to address these things systemically, because we know it's 20 years from now, we're going to be there again if we don't address it right now. So those three levels, but it's a lot, you know, but as many of you that went through school, one class at a time, right? You know, you just keep going. Yeah.
And for us, we're on the program level of this. So working with Port of Entry, our goal is to get all of the parties at the table trying to prepare so that people don't fall through the safety net. So it's partnerships. It's partnerships for what you don't do. Have someone at the table who does do that. As we're trying to go, as Sean said, and catch things upstream. When you have partners at the table on the local level, you can kind of hear about these things and be aware of these things and start to put things in place socially as well, so that you can try to be in place to catch them in time. So for us, it's ground level structure, putting together the right partnerships, having the right people at the table. We have, as you mentioned, HUD-VASH earlier. HUD-VASH is at our table. We have the VA there. We have Volunteers of America at the table as well. So we're all talking and we're all planning to see what's the best intervention for people who are precariously housed, people who are imminently facing homelessness, and those who are already experiencing it.
Thank you so much. I'm looking at the time and we went over a couple minutes. I apologize, but the conversation was so great and there were still other comments. And I will say we did specifically get a mahalo from someone in Hawaii. So just thought Darryl might appreciate that. But for all, we did get you all did get a mahalo for that. Sean, Jeffrey, Darryl, again, thank you for this great conversation, great information, and for helping us as NCHB, but all of us in this work as we move forward and try to infuse equity in everything we do and be aware and conscious of what we're doing. Thank you all. Thank you everybody who attended and stuck through a conversation that may have been a little uncomfortable for folks at the time, and that's what we're here to do. So we appreciate you all. Thank you again. Enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.
Right, Jeff. I'll be in touch.
Oh, absolutely.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure.
All right, buddy. I enjoyed.
Yeah, same. Keep up the good work.